Tēnā koutou katoa, me karakia tātou, whakatakatahau ki te uru, whakatakatahau ki te tonga, kia mā kina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. E hiaki ana, ti ata kura, e teo, e huka, e hauhu, tihei, Māori ora. Tuatahi, ka mihi ki te mana whenua o tēnā rohi, ko Ngāti Toa Rangatira, ko Te Ati Awa, kei te mihi, tēnā koutou. E nā manahuri, ka mihi kia Dr. Brent Duckor, koroa Dr. Carrie Holmberg, o te rā tēnā koroa, kei te mihi, kei te mihi. Kia koutou katoa, nau mai, haere mai, ki te runanga rangahau, mā tauranga o Aotearoa, ki NZCR, nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Graham. Thank you so much, Graham. Kia ora koutou, ko Charles Da, toku ingoa. Good morning. I'm Charles Da from the New Zealand Council for Educational Research, and we're really happy to see people joining us today. We know for so many of you it's in the middle of your holidays, but we think this is a wonderful opportunity that we've got at an international level to welcome two guests to talk about a very important topic, and that's why we have so many people that have registered today. So on my left, or at the head of the table, we have Professor Brent Duckor from San Jose State University, along with Dr. Carrie Holmberg, who lectures at the same university. Brent is the Executive Director of their newly launched Centre for Innovation and Applied Education Policy. And Dr. Holmberg is also involved in that centre as the Assistant Director, or as an Assistant Director of the assessment and of the assessment area in that work. So I'm going to have very little to do today. I will tell you about how the day is organised and some of the housekeeping things, and then we'll hand over. So first of all, Brent and Carrie are going to present, and it's going to be wonderful to hear their perspective and the work that they've done on something that I really enjoy, which is the application of assessment in the classroom. And then, because we're in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we're going to have an opportunity for a New Zealand perspective to be involved in that. So we're really fortunate that we can welcome Professor Carrie and Professor Gavin Brown, who have just been prepared to give up some of their time to come along and be part of the seminar and then to be involved at the end in responding. And part of that response will be the opportunity for questions from people who are viewing to be kind of responded to. So during the presentation, if you have a question, there is a Q&A function at the bottom of the screen that you can use. And what we'll do is we'll see if we can select some of those questions so that we can have a discussion about them at the end. So please feel free to put them down. The other thing that will happen is that we are recording this presentation. So if you have to go at some point, or if you want to make sure that your colleagues get to see this, there will be a link made available so that you can watch it at your pleasure. We won't keep the chat function open. We've got a lot of participants, so we wouldn't really be able to manage the chat, but the Q&A, a part of the Zoom functionality, will be open. So please use that for your questions. So without further ado, we'll get into this. I'm really looking forward to it. I think there's something quite special and it's going to be well worth your time. So sit back, hope you've got a cup of coffee, something like that, to see you through and keep your mind alert, and we'll get on with it. Thanks.
Thank you, Charles. Our talk today is meaningful feedback for continuous improvement in the classroom. And Brent Duckor and I are just so grateful that you're taking a momentary break in your summer to be with us today. And we love being here in Aotearoa with you. Thank you. So our topics today in this portion of the webinar are to address these 4 questions. First, we'll speak briefly about who we are and what got us interested in the topic of feedback. We'll next address what do we know about feedback and its effects on student learning, also teacher learning. Third, what are essential features of feedback for deeper learning? And we'll introduce something called a progress guide, and we'll talk about the role of a process model, which we'll talk about. Fourth and finally, How does one, no matter what your role is in education, how does one get started with deep feedback dives? And by dives, we mean exploring areas of your practice with the idea of continuous improvement for students and teachers as well. So our introductions, and thank you, Charles, for that kind introduction. Brent and I were both teachers, but we were both teachers in very different contexts. On the left-hand side, if you're following along with the slide, you can see it says SPESS or SPES in New York City. So that's a special high school that was small and innovative in New York City, and which Brent taught at, and teachers, you can see a picture of him with his advisees, his student, he has a small group of students he was to advise. Whereas my experience in teaching, you can see by the photo there, it's a much larger high school. That's the senior class that one year. I wasn't teaching the year that photo was snapped, but it was a suburban school. And so a very contrasting experiences we had.
We like to think of it as we've covered both coasts of a very large country, the East Coast and the West Coast. And a lot of our insights have come from deeper dives and experiences with teachers who informed how we came to understand our early practice as beginning teachers.
And while our contexts were different, what we did share in the US, we called it Title I school. It's where students of low income and their families did not have much money. So the students out of both our schools, majority fell into that category.
It's important for us because a lot of the motivation to study feedback, I think, has been about serving what we call social justice or aspirations for college and career for children who traditionally have not had access to those sorts of opportunities. So we bring a very deep sense of equity to the work that we do.
And so just briefly, a little bit more, as Charles mentioned, I'm Assistant Director of Assessment and Evaluation at the Center for Innovation in Applied Education Policy. It's new at San Jose State and hoping to make some big splashes in the years ahead. As a classroom teacher, I want to highlight that I earned my national board certification, right? So there's state certification and then there's national. So I did that twice. It's optional. No one is required to do that in California, where I'm from. And I have my EDD in educational leadership.
Should also shout out, Carrie, that you were at Stanford STEP program working with Dr. Lee Shulman, Dr. Darlene Hammond, Dr. Cuban, Larry Cuban. Some really heavy hitters in our field, and also I think in the vision of how we met, the work that I did in New York City turned out to be a very important part of what Stanford was articulating as powerful, deep, ambitious teaching practice for children, in our case of color. My background is, of course, I'm now director at the Center for Innovation and Applied Education Policy and professor at San Jose State. I should also mention that I received my doctorate in quantitative methods and evaluation, and I studied under Dr. Mark Wilson, who was an Australian. We won't hold that against him here in New Zealand. But Mark informed a lot of the work that I thought about how to connect teacher growth, teacher development, teacher-centered assessment practices with more traditional forms of testing and evaluation. We've had an opportunity at San Jose State for the last 15 years to pioneer a course that is dedicated exclusively to the building of assessment proficiencies and skills among our pre-service teachers. It turns out that in the California State University system, there are 23 campuses. We do a lot of the work of developing and supporting beginning teachers for certification. It also turns out that of those 23 campuses, not more than one or two have a dedicated assessment course for our teachers of math, science, language arts, music, art, world languages, physical education, and history. So we try to bring a single subject focus, that is competency in subject matter teaching, but we also want to see depth of knowledge around assessment. And the course is allowed for that to develop. So this course helped to develop some of the ideas that we're going to talk about today in this book, and also informed some of the ideas in our previous book. We should say that our previous book, Mastering Formative Assessment Moves, was really the outgrowth of what we learned about working with teachers, both in the classroom who were mentoring and supporting our beginning teachers, as well as our pre-service candidates. Our latest book is going to be the focus of today's talk on feedback, but the two are really linked, and we invite you to take a look at both. So Here you go, why feedback? Well, that's a big question. It's an essential question that I think we all can ask at any level of an organization. And I think parents want to know about it. I think teachers want to know about it. I think students want to know about it. Sometimes feedback can seem like something that is mostly criticism, putting people down, making them feel small. And we know that feedback is not always well received. And there's a lot of studies that tell us about that. But I think what we also know is that feedback is ubiquitous. It happens all the time, and we may not even know that it's feedback. We may just think about it as information. Somebody's just sharing a perspective, giving me an idea that I hadn't thought of before. Common sense and research shows that over 30 years of studies on the effects of formative feedback have actual proven learning gains associated with them. So in a sense, we don't really have to act like we're inventing the wheel here. John Hattie and Helen Timperley's work in 2007 sets out a framework for studies of studies or meta-analyses looking at the power of feedback. Of course, these folks are from New Zealand, so we give a shout out to New Zealanders. We learn from them in the globe and the world that we live in, and we paid careful attention to their findings.
Yeah, especially their 4 levels of feedback. We have some intersections with that.
We do. And so we sort of know that there are good reasons to trust our intuitions about what works with feedback, just based on our personal experience in teaching and learning. We know that today we're talking to a lot of our classroom teachers in this webinar, which is very exciting because that's where we live and breathe. So we already know that what you're doing matters, and we know that there's good policy support for what you're doing because there's actual effects associated with learning gains. I think the general consensus by now, after a good 20 to 25 years of study of feedback, is that we can identify at least 4 or 5 major descriptors for it. First of all, formative feedback always starts with the positive. It's an assets-based model. We don't start with the deficit. When people say I felt like it was criticism, that usually means you started with a deficit model. Let's go to the asset model first.
Well, this is not to say that as a classroom teacher that the negative doesn't jump out to you. It just means not to voice that first.
Or maybe pause and think about how to position the positive. Uses specific non-judgmental language to indicate areas of improvement. Again, these are things that have been written about by many scholars, including Grant Wiggins. We all know that non-judgmental language matters. How do I hear you? I hear you when you're not making me feel small. When you judge me, I tend to feel less able to hear what you're saying. So if we're talking about just oral exchanges or verbal exchanges of feedback, we want to make sure that we're saying things that can be heard, but also the word specific matters. And that leads to the next point. Targets a small number of areas where the student is ready to improve and provides guidance about what to do next. We're going to call that in our book, and again, next steps. What's going on in the feedback iteration that generates a next step or two that a student can actually do to make progress? And last but not least, provides students with opportunities for revision, the R word. Now, this can be really scary because when we work across 8 multiple subject areas, we often hear our PE teachers or others, including our arts teachers, say, well, what do you mean by revision? I'm not having students write essays in my class. So does revision include me? And we say, yes, revision is actually a process of giving the feedback that has uptake, and the student can then redo, rethink, reposition. Try again the assessment activity. So revision should be thought of not merely as something that our language arts teachers do.
And I just want to jump in and say that these are all things as classroom teachers that you're already doing. We know this.
We do. And so the question is, how do we take what we're doing well and accelerate it a little further? And have our students actually start to do it? Because one of the things we're going to mention today is peer-to-peer assessment. So what you're seeing here seems sort of obvious to the teacher, but what if you have a small group of students working on an art gallery project where they're giving feedback on each other's work in the art classroom? Don't you want your students primed to know how to use non-judgmental language and to be positive with each other as peers so that actually the children can hear each other? So I think this goes back to that idea of this is good for everybody in a learning community. So yes, formative feedback, but what's the sweet spot? What's the place of leverage and action and change for all of us? So Carrie's going to talk to us a little bit about the formative feedback framework and give us a sense of how we can get started.
Yeah. So this image that you're seeing is the framework. We're calling it the formative feedback framework. Another way to call it or think of it as a mental model that we're offering as a way to make sense of what's happening regarding feedback in your classroom. And we're going to start by noticing at the top where it says context for learning. And there are generally speaking, we think 3 different kinds of contexts for learning, right? Traditionally, face-to-face. Students, the teacher in the classroom, whether that's 9 students in a classroom at a small school, as we saw, in the Northland as we were visiting before this trip, or a larger school, a classroom that might have 32 students per classroom in there. Blended is when it's a combination of distance learning with face-to-face learning. And then as many of us remember from the pandemic, right, Brent and I actually taught in that distance learning where we never met our students for a whole semester face-to-face ever. It was a fully distance. And of course, these are just general. There could be different kinds of contexts that would fit onto this framework as well. We've just chosen these 3. And then I want to invite you to look at the base of this framework. And you see these double arrows roughly approximating a triangle shape. And at the top of that triangle shape, these ideas here kind of undergird everything there is that we think to talk about feedback in the classroom. And that's this talking about what are the learning goals. You might also refer to them as standards. It could just be more specifically thought of as skills that students are aiming to learn, that you're hoping students will learn. And then working across counterclockwise from that triangle, from the learning goals, right? If we have what do we want them to learn? What kinds of tasks and projects and activities will the students engage in? This is essential to have a grasp on and have some clarity around if you are going to unpack your own feedback practices in your classroom. That's what we're inserting. And that's, again, why we have this lavender block of this, triangle ideas under at the base of the framework or mental model. And then continuing counterclockwise around, right, is a vertex of the triangle to talk about how to make sense of the students' engagement with the task, projects, and activities, right? A common way that many teachers engage in is they use rubrics for assessment of student responses, whether those responses are written, whether they are performed, right? They don't have to be written, whether they are oral, think of an oral presentation, right? We're going to introduce progress guides, that's the middle one, and you could dream up your own next steps organizers. If there's anything that Brent and I are, we are not controlling, we are open for flexibility, we value, and teacher agency. Right, we would not have worked together if we weren't believers in teacher agency. And so I want to draw attention to that next steps organizers, if you have improvements, it's just a jumping off point, what we're going to offer you today.
And let me just say, Carrie, quickly, that
Sure.
triangle is based on the National Research Council 2001, Knowing What Students Know text,
Yes.
a very important seminal text that I recommend to any policymaker all the way to any teacher. It basically said, if you're using an evidence-based framework for thinking about student growth, you want to make sure that you have sense of what all those things are. What are your learning goals? How are they connected to the kinds of tasks you're inviting children to be a part of? And then once you have those tasks, what are you learning from what they know and can do? And where would you like to see areas of growth and improvement as the person who's leading the classroom? So this idea of evidence-based really comes out of this without using those fancy words. We think this is something that's digestible and sensible, and every teacher is already doing it. It's just a question of finding language to start to name and connect the dots.
Because having a mental model to name what's happening is also a way to unpack it and improve on it, and perhaps change your practices. So let's look at the center of this formative feedback framework. We see in the center there, it says lenses, and on the left hand, we've got 3 categories of one kind of lens, directionality lens. We then in the center have 3 of configuration, 3 configurations, and then 3 modalities. And I'm going to start from right and work my way left. Let's talk about modalities, right? Because so often in the classroom, feedback is spoken, and it's often a teacher speaking to a child. But that's there are other modalities. I was a high school English teacher. I spent more hours than I needed to in the old days writing written comments on students' drafts. Nonverbal is a modality as well. you know that this is important, but you may not necessarily have talked about it with your colleagues about how to improve your nonverbal practice and to coach your students in what nonverbal, let's just call them messages, right, that we're sending with one another. But we know it matters. We can make someone more anxious. We can set them at ease, that sort of thing. It's undeniable that there's an important role of the nonverbal informative feedback. Let's go to the configuration. It matters whether a feedback dialogue is happening with the whole class, whether a small group of students, or just one-on-one, right? Students tend to feel more in the spotlight when it's just the one-on-one, whether they're meeting with another student or whether it's teacher and student. So you have that intuitive sense of course, configuration matters. And directionality, about feedback, I think we're always aiming to coach people into recognizing that it's a dialogic process, right? It can't always have that back and forth we want. And yet, even with that back and forthness, we can recognize that in many cases, it's mostly teacher driven. In other cases, it's peer-to-peer driven. And what we're hoping for is that students have the tools and the agency and the empowerment for self-driven formative feedback, because we want them to be motivated lifetime learners. And self-driven feedback can encourage that.
Yeah, when we were researching this book, it took about 3 years to put this together during the pandemic. The pandemic, unfortunately, was a gift. It was a gift to force us into distance learning. We'd never done it before, hybrid frameworks as well. So we started to realize that a lot of the feedback literature was written in a face-to-face pre-pandemic world. And so there's real questions about feedback and research going forward on what's going to make a difference in hybrid situations. But also when we started to think about not being face-to-face, all the taken for grantedness we did with nonverbal. I'm just looking at our chapter 10 on nonverbal feedback, and I remember creating this little matrix here, nonverbal immediacy cues, and it made me think, I never really considered proximity as an important feature of feedback delivery. Well, when you're on Zoom, or even when you're in a large classroom, proximity can be a real challenge. The same with eye gaze, gestures, body position, movement. These are things that you masterfully see on display in the field, a rugby team, a swim coach. You see an art teacher, you see a music teacher leading an orchestra. They are masters of nonverbal communication and feedback. But we think some of that good energy and work can come over into the more traditional classroom settings. It matters how we position ourselves towards students, and we wouldn't have thought much about that if it hadn't been for the dislocations of the pandemic. So in some ways, the book is really a review of the past, but it's a call to the future. What are we going to do to address these things and not get so overwhelmed? When you look at this mental model, you might say, oh my gosh, we're going to talk about in a minute how you can pick one thing. You could just focus on your peer-driven protocols of having kids give each other feedback and try it out. You could focus on your spoken combined with your written and realize you can use multiple technologies in addition to a pen, paper and pencil, right? So there are lots of ways to play in the system. That's the goal, is play and learning.
Yeah, so let's talk about directionality for a moment. I briefly mentioned, but these images here will help us, right? If we can have 3 different lenses on this focal point, right? Teacher driven. So directionality, who is most responsible for the actions occurring in a set of formative feedback practices? Whether those are just oral in conversation, whether they are written, whether they are a mix. Right, that responsibility matters. I think it needs to be recognized if we are to improve our feedback practices. Another way to think of it is like the primary driver of a process or processes happening and getting done. So teacher driven, peer-to-peer driven, and self-driven. We've got that picture of that little boy, like he's really thinking hard about his work and what he's doing.
I do a lot of, as Carrie does, observation of teachers. So we do walkthroughs. We've sat for 45 minutes in a lesson and taken direct notes through the whole lesson. I mean, there's a lot you can learn in 1,000 hours of that kind of practice. And one thing we sometimes debrief with our teachers is, so who do you think was most responsible, or who was the most active in the feedback today? That question alone initiates a lot of important ideas about how to get better at what we're doing, and also how to honor what went well and what we need to work on.
And there are some kind of challenges, I think, with each of these directionalities. Let's think of teacher-driven for an instant. When we think of improving our practice, kind of a pitfall of teacher-driven feedback is that the teacher does too much of the talking and takes too much of the responsibility. And so one way I talk with my beginning teachers is just about ratios of talk time, because that's concrete, it's measurable, and it's something that can change, right? So if the teacher's talking 90% of the time and the child only 10, right, what does that say? That kind of suggests, just by that ratio alone, of some things that may or may not be going on. Configurations similarly have their own emphasis in what you think about feedback. And so in different configurations in the classroom, we're going to think about how seating arrangements are what they are, right? And by seating arrangements, whether it's, you know, sitting on the carpet, it doesn't have to be desks involved. It could be, and by, again, spatial arrangements, it can be outside, right? Lessons happening outside, which I hear there are a lot of those happening in New Zealand. I love to hear that. Interpersonal dynamics and coaching youngsters about how to work and talk with one another, ways to start on the positives, how to close an interaction on a positive note, which is all about collaboration and other routines that you can teach. And finally, modalities. We get started with the nonverbal, right? These modalities explore the challenges, and there's definite potential benefits of having routines around written feedback, spoken feedback, nonverbal, right? One routine I use with my own students, who at the time were ages 14 and 15, is that if we were talking one-on-one, they, as a student, were the ones who wrote down their understanding of the conversation, right? And if it couldn't be written in a small note-taking form, and if they couldn't write it, I was not doing my job as a communication. So that was one routine I built. You can come up with your own, of course. But there are, again, Brent and I always call them affordances and constraints of each modality. And of course, they will always be mixed. There will always be, right? There may not be the written, but there's always nonverbal and spoken. And I tend to be a proponent for blending written and spoken.
We've noticed, even in working with students now in the more high-tech environments, for us it's high-tech. I feel embarrassed to say that as a baby boomer, I guess. I think it's high-tech if we're on PDF documents putting comments, or if we're on a Google Doc slide with our students and writing comments. And we're learning that when we did a lot of that work in the pandemic, the first turn of feedback comes from, let's say, the teacher to the student. It sits on the slide, but it may not get addressed. It may be left behind. It may be resolved with a click of a button, but nothing was really resolved. And in that sense, we're now heightening our understanding of modalities as well, because we're realizing even what we consider to be straightforward written feedback in the form of a digital comment still needs to be iterated. It still needs to be looped, as we call it. It still needs to be brought inside of the new schema that's building for the actual student who's learning the topics. So yeah, it's kind of exciting time in that way if you use this frame, I think.
Yeah. And so our book has ways to unpack each of these directionalities, configurations, and modalities. I mean, each of them, so like all 9, right? With guiding questions in every chapter. A section dedicated to planning. And I think those are just charts, right? Yeah, and what to consider and why it matters. Because whether your planning, you know, happens in the morning quickly, or it happens in a common planning time that your department, your school is large enough to have in a department, you know how important planning is. We do base practices that we suggest or offer in research. And so each chapter in our book tells us what the research tells us and suggests. And
yeah, I just think that's really important to us, that we do believe in research-based work, and we have spent time with our colleagues. The reason we invited our esteemed colleagues today to be discussants with us is we really want to hear from people who've been looking at feedback for years. So we took the time to figure out what the research tells us, but we didn't leave it there. It's about scaffolds, what to do tomorrow, and what to try. And that's part of why we've taken the time to write this kind of a book, because we want there to be things for people to see. If you take even a look at the video modules, that was kind of fun to play with QR codes in this book.
Yeah, and this book can be used just as a solo teacher or as a whole department, or even larger than that. Each chapter does have suggestions and kind of things to think about as a group and as an individual. So it's flexible in that way.
So what do we know about feedback? Well,
Well, it has the potential to really build between students and teachers and students, a dialogue that is beyond what has already been happening, which fosters, we think, trust and coming with that resilience. So to work together, right? Because learning and substantial change doesn't happen in a blink of an eye or overnight. It takes a relationship that is strong. And many of you know, because you get to work with the same students as they grow for years and have them more than 1 year, how true this is.
Yeah, these are things that people call non-cognitive outcomes or non-cognitive indicators. And we hear a lot about building capacity for socio-emotional learning. We hear even about culturally responsive pedagogies that allow taking the students' background assets, everything they bring, and giving them the sense of we trust their knowledge and we trust their process. And we believe that feedback really augments that. And in a way, all of those ambitions will be better served if we can just focus a little more attention on feedback for learners. Well, we wanted to give you something concrete, right? And so we're going to try to do that with discussing a little bit about the role of progress guides, one of the new ideas out of this work. This goes back to the basic notion that for students, for parents, guardians, and for teachers, there need to be concrete, visible, what we call scaffolds. This actually comes out of the language of Vygotsky. And Vygotsky's notion not only of zone of proximal development, but that every child is using language and other tools to access and build knowledge. So we want these things to be somewhat visible so that everyone can share them socially. And part of that is realizing where we're situated. Yes, we want to give kids concrete things to do in class. That helps them to better understand the work that we're teaching. But we also think we need to zoom out a little bit. And this is where we're going to call out the idea of a shared project. We believe that a shared project is at the core of good teaching. If teaching is nothing more than, here's the textbook, here's the worksheet, fill in the blanks, I'll collect it at the end of the day, I'll tally the points, I'll upload the grade. If that's what teaching is, then we would say that can only be a small part of the day's lesson.
And that's not who's attending this webinar.
Yes, so we're going to go in the other direction and we're going to say that every single time you give an activity to children that's more than 1 minute or 1 hour that might occur over multiple days, that is what we mean by the word project. It's something that's going to require us to iterate over time. So we start with the idea of setting a purpose. We believe that young people should be invited in our classrooms to setting the purpose of the activity and the outcomes that we think we're all as a community of learners trying to achieve. Next thing that's related to that is agreeing on very specific goals. What are the goals of this assignment? What are the goals of this activity? What do we expect to know and be able to do by the time we're done? 3 and 4, planning next moves and developing drafts, is where the feedback exchange action's at. That's where the revision piece is. That's where okay, that looks great. Do you think you could add a little bit more detail to that? Or did you think that maybe it might be worth going back and looking at some of that work we did yesterday? In other words, you're giving feedback, but you're doing it around this idea that the students have an activity and it's ongoing over time. It's only in the 5th, what we call moment of this cycle, that you're actually evaluating the assignment, evaluating the project. So if I can be concrete here, science labs. A lot of students using science labs, they're learning how to form hypotheses, they're learning how to conduct an experiment, they're learning how to collect data, they're learning how to analyze that data. We see this in our high schools in California. We would say that really don't bring out that rubric to slap that grade on until you've gone through the other 4 moments of this particular process. Grades will be coming, but they're not coming at the beginning, they're not coming in the middle. In the beginning and the middle is, what can we do to augment, to improve the draft you have of your science lab report? You're doing great with hypothesis formation. It looks like your data collection is pretty strong, but I'm noticing the conclusions you're drawing right now are not yet as strong as they could be, as valid as they could be. How do you give that next step feedback before, in the 3rd week, you collect the labs and grade them? That's really the idea here, is how to build in that process.
So we're calling this the process model, this image that you see of the circle. And we promised that we'd talk about progress guides and process model, right? So we're talking about the process model, but I just wanted to say one more thing about that on the process model, is that even though it says developing drafts, for that shared goal, right, you agreed on a goal that you're gonna do with students, there may not actually be a whole lot that's written. It's not draft in the sense of paper and pencil or typed out, right? It could be a performance that they're practicing for. Maybe you teach choir, and it's you're revising and improving for a performance that the parents are going to see, the guardians.
It could be all nonverbal,
Yeah.
and the drafting could be, again, a metaphor. It's not literally drafting a document. It is the idea of revising and rethinking where you are. Thanks, Carrie. That's important. Well, we know that most folks who do performance-based assessment or do instructional tasks where they have some guiding criteria or goals for students will often use a rubric. It's very common, at least in the States. And I think what we now know is that while rubrics are wonderful for summative grading, they may not give us that just-in-time feedback when the actual project is being unfolded. So we're going to pivot that rubric concept and explode it a little bit into, let's take one strand of the rubric idea of a learning goal and criteria, and let's focus on evidence. And here you'll see just a quick example of what a progress guide might look like, and did actually look like in a project we did with schools in Oregon, where we say, on the one side, well, I'm not ready as a starting point for some of our students. In a differentiated classroom, there are going to be some students who say, I'm not ready. I don't really know what this assignment's about. Then there's going to be some students who say, well, I can kind of repeat what the question is, or what I think you want this assignment to be, and they'll sort of type some things in or they'll write them down. That's going to be a group of students in a classroom that's differentiated and diverse. Then there's some students say, well, I can actually take a position on this particular topic. I can say I'm for this or against it or whatever. And then the next place is I can add some evidence to support my claim. And even above that is I'm pretty good at saying the pros and cons. So just thinking about this as a light touch scaffold for students, the key idea is actually on the right-hand column. It's my next steps are. We want the student to kind of circle a level on the left and then approximate what they think their next steps are, because that's where we go back to the agency and the ownership over self-driven feedback. This is just a schema or a picture or a graphic. Every teacher can put in any information they want for where they think the progressive goals are. And they can do it in a way that's kid-friendly, that's appropriate to the grade level. We've even had some of our student teachers who started to play with these progress guides say that their mentor teachers started to adopt them extremely quickly. And they started using pictures of like butterflies, cocoon up to, in a science unit, a fully formed butterfly. Even the idea that it's children friendly, that it has a sense of growth to it. And it's not about labeling, it's not about grading. These are never graded. They're simply qualitative descriptors of where I think I am now and where I think I can go with some help.
Yeah, so we've looked at two images that, while it gave a specific example, we're going to go a little bit deeper into a case study that occurred in Oregon with the Department of Education there, so a state just north of us where we live in California. And we were fortunate to be able to work with some teachers who are teaching children who are 11 to at oldest about 13 years old. And they had an environmental science curriculum and unit that was about understanding the causes and the consequences of events. And specifically, this event that happened in the US years ago called the Dust Bowl.
It may happen again, the way things are going.
Yes, all right. So do we need to say anything more background knowledge about the Dust Bowl before we continue?
I don't know, I just thought it was such a cool
so
assignment because
Alright.
it allowed the kids to do humanities and science at the same
Yes.
project.
Yes. And so these teachers had a goal of linking their assessment with student self-assessment. So they wanted what the teachers were assessing to be connected and in a real way with what the students were assessing. There wasn't a strong culture of student self-assessment at these schools yet. And another way to think of that is by saying linking summative unit test items, right, with these formative first draft task responses, right? So they're kind of casual, they're kind of quick, whether it's done at the end of class. In the States, we call it an exit slip, right? To leave the class, you have to exit, you have to write something down to give to your teacher, or just something that's jotted down quickly in class, which we call a quick write.
And part of that project, we were invited to work with UC Berkeley researchers who were developing a more formalized traditional way of assessing the students at a kind of, you could say, higher standardized level. But we came in to provide the link to say, look, it's great to have standardized test questions, but what's being done to practice up to those questions, and how can the curriculum build in these little quick writes and exit slips to get students closer to approximating the kind of performance they're going to have to do by the either end of the semester or mid-semester. So this was the idea of kind of uniting purposes of summative and formative together. Anyways, it was an interesting project. Let's say some more about it.
Let's see what it looks like. So this is an example of a progress guide. So a progress guide that a student is going to use to self-assess, right? So when, so on the left-hand side, right, we see students choosing where their current work is, where it is. And they say, I can do this, I can do that, I can do this one, right? With the least sophisticated at the bottom, the most sophisticated at the top. Again, that top to bottom orientation is not what's important. What's important for differentiation of feedback and for supporting students, right, is that there's enough description that all the students in the classroom will have a place to put their work.
And you may notice that this is kind of sparse in the language. You might say, well, God, that's kind of fourth grade reading level. We don't make assumptions about the progress guides in terms of reading levels, but we do think this. We teach language learners and we care deeply about access and equity around making sure that language is not a barrier to studying science in this case. Of course, there's scientific vocabulary that every student will learn. And of course, there's academic language that's associated with all sorts of outcomes. But we want to say, students need things that are readable, accessible, and understandable. Even the word evidence could be used as a moment of pause to unpack the academic language demands of that term for non-native speakers and or first bilingual emergence. So the point is, we want to make sure that there are those opportunities for teachers to be reflective with their EL students in our case. And also for all students, because I've talked with so many people who said, why should we assume that a sixth grader understands the word evidence, and why shouldn't we constantly be unpacking that term across multiple contexts so they become more familiar with that schema?
On the right-hand column,
on
the right-hand column, students are writing in what their next steps in this project, in this draft, right? Remember, draft includes a performance, not just something written, right? What there is. So we're asking them, inviting them to commit to two in this case, right? This progress guide offers two. Students won't necessarily know what to put down there, but that's the part of the purpose of the scaffold, is that it invites conversation between students and their table mates, their student sitting next to them, student and the teacher, right? Some teachers we know who have used this, they have brainstormed as a class, what are some possible next steps, like a menu of 8 or 10 different things that you could write down as a way to kind of prime and offer suggestions for students before they're self-assessing. And the other thing is, like, hands will shoot up and they'll be asking the teacher for a detailed conversation. And what a good spot that is for students to be in, is that they're asking for more. Again, maybe some of them are doing it just to fill out a worksheet, right? I'm not so cynical as that, because I've been in the classrooms with these students who are 11 years old, 12 years old, and they sure, I mean, if they weren't genuine, like, they tricked me, because they sure sounded genuinely interested in finding out what ways they could proceed with their work.
Yeah, Carrie's actually referring to a case study that we did right off the pandemic at one of our local school districts. And we have masks and all, the teacher utilizing the progress guide to, again, assess formatively, but turn it into, again, a whole class opportunity to brainstorm, get ideas, have students see each other's ideas. So there's just so many affordances that go with this. Differentiating feedback, a really important idea. We want to be thinking about the task prompts. How are we designing the questions? Are the questions open-ended enough? Are they inviting exploration for the children? Can the progress guide support and augment some of the academic language demands of the actual task? Can it allow students to get deeper while they're building their knowledge up on the content of the topic? And then really most importantly is sample student responses. We learned this from our friends in Australia. I certainly in New York City, as you did in California, had a chance to do, looking at student responses collectively as teachers and making sense of those responses in terms of not just misconceptions, but alternative conceptions, as Dr. Cowie would say, looking for common patterns in responses that aren't just about Could I assign an appropriate grade? But more importantly, what is the ongoing idea that's coming across the class? And what do I need to do to work with that idea? So we have a task description, right? But we really just want to say, this is just the initial invitation.
Yeah, to the students, right? So they had read some articles, they call them, some of the students call them stories, I wanna say. I think they've seen some videos about documentary about the Dust Bowl. And their teacher presented them with this question: the Dust Bowl, was it a man-made problem with man-made solutions, right? What do you take a position, et cetera? And we're just look at these two samples here.
These are actual responses, you
Actual
transcribe
students,
them out of the handbook.
right? And so where there was a spelling error, we left the spelling error.
purpose, yeah.
So this student have to be called student C, wrote, this statement is partially true, but the story, I remember reference the story says economic depression coupled with extended drought, unusually high temperatures, poor agricultural practices, and resulting wind erosion all contributed to the Dust Bowl. 2 of these 4 problems were not man-made, so the Dust Bowl couldn't have been completely man-made. Right, so that's one student response. They have a quote, they don't have the end quote, that's missing in there, right? But they've picked a sensible quote to make their point. Student A wrote, yes, because it prevented farmers from selling or growing crops.
Now the beauty of these responses for all the policymakers out there and all the big thinkers in testing and assessment and all the folks who are so interested in psychometric scaling is that none of that matters, in my opinion, until someone has actually taken the time to read this response and say, I'm in a classroom on Tuesday, 3rd week of my semester, and I need to give feedback to these students, student A and student B, and they are not at the same level, but more importantly, what am I gonna focus on? Because if I'm a certain kind of mindset, I'm gonna just look for spelling and grammar corrections and errors. Because that's gonna get me to my glass of wine very fast. If I'm another kind of disposition or mindset, I'm gonna say, wow, yes, there are grammar and syntax issues, and on my rubric, I have that. But what I'm really interested in is the student who was not quite yet ready to use evidence to support a position, either by quoting or even by saying 2 out of 4. So how do I think about Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, my intervention for going back into the class and going back over perhaps, how do we identify a problem? How do we take a position? And what are some examples? And one could even imagine in this example, sharing something like this with students, not from the semester that it was produced, but from the previous semester, anonymized, and saying, hey, everybody, this is a problem of practice. This is a problem and a challenge for us. Let's look at the 2 different responses and let's figure out what is one student doing that another's not yet, that's the key word, not yet doing, and what would you do to improve it? Turn to your table partner and talk and come up with one answer. Share it back out. Makes it formative. Makes it feedback oriented.
Right, what would the progress guide, the student self-assessment progress guide for the student look like? What would they write down as the next step? What could they do?
Now, this is a scary chart for people who love charts, but we love that some people love charts, so we put them up there. Some people do want to look at the percentage breakdown in much of the way that somebody who wanted to understand results would do. You know, what group of students is in this group exemplary, what group are beginning, what group haven't even responded yet because they didn't come to class for 3 days. What am I gonna do on my next steps? What are the to be determines that I don't yet know? What are the extension activities, the augmentation I might give a student who's exemplary? In other words, a student who could use more than just weighing evidence. At this point, what would be their next step? But if I've got many, let's say, 45% of my students at developing, that is, they can take a position, but they're not yet using evidence. That's just in time information for me to go back to the next lesson and begin to think about augmenting. So what does it mean again to use a primary source, and what are the ones we have available? And could we use the video clip or could we use a quote? This is where the teacher is iterating where the students are with their existing ZPD and trying to make a marginal change before the grading comes in a couple of weeks. Here again.
Yeah, so let's take this just column by column. Right, so the hypothetical teacher who filled this out, we see some tallies in the leftmost column. It says count or percent, and it looks like there are 10 students whose responses to that Dust Bowl question, is it man-made or is it natural, man-made or not, right? Students B, E, F, G, that's the pseudonyms for the students, right? Their work has fallen into this category, which is add some evidence. They are adding some evidence. We see here then in that middlemost column, 2 out of all those students, the 10 students, right? We got response B and response E of what they actually wrote. And then an example, these are teacher generated next steps. What is the teacher going to do in class the next day or 2 or 3 or 4? Because 10 of this teacher's students' work falls into that category. And we see in the bolded, they all say 1, there are 3 that we see, and they are bolded. And one says, well, the student could highlight the evidence that they have so far in 3 different colors, right? And then there's a reason for which colors to use and how to break that down, right? To encourage students to get a critical eye on what evidence they've used. They may not even know at this point there's like different kinds of evidence or different weights of evidence. Another suggestion is to consider all the evidence you have that's the next thing. Okay, in the 3 different colors and categories. And then the teacher suggests reread the exemplar. So there is an exemplar. That means a positive example, often best and most often student generated, right? Although in my beginning teacher career, we would generate them when we never taught that unit before. We'd fake ourselves being students.
And
so
then
we could
replace them.
And then
once you
replace
had
them,
the
of course,
student
once we had
exemplar.
them. Yes, that's when we had extra energy.
So those ideas again are just tools to sort of think about, even if you never wrote one of these again, if you never even did it once, if you went to your teacher training program or your professional development and you just saw this, you must say, I can't do that. I've got much more interesting things to do with my kids than this. What you could think of is if you've got 1 or 2 signature assignments in your semester, 1 or 2 critical big assignments that you sort of think are the critical touch points of this particular semester, you might put more attention on those to look at your pattern distributions.
Yeah.
And again, why? Not because you're trying to bean count, but because you're trying to figure out, do I have a good sense on the intuitive knowledge I have, pedagogical content knowledge of the students' needs, but do I also have a good sense of what is the typical semester by semester layout of the land on who and where people will be stuck?
Brent, I'm gonna offer a third reason. And that's because if you care about equity, and I know each of you attending this webinar today does care about equity, having a careful way to differentiate your feedback and differentiate your instruction, right? Because feedback and instruction, right, they go like this. It's going to teach you something important.
And I think it actually makes your life easier because once you see the patterns and the systems, they just start appearing to you without even having to really use these kinds of scaffolds anymore. So let's leave it like this. Why are feedback and feed forward guides linked to tasks? Why do these things matter? And when we say tasks, again, we don't mean standardized tasks. We don't mean unstandardized tasks. We don't mean formal, informal. You decide what you consider to be the interesting activities and things that students are doing in your class. But what's critical is that you start to be able to, with them, sense make, start to see the patterns and responses. And we want to invite ourselves into thinking more deeply about kind of where is that differentiation in terms of what we might call buckets, without necessarily having to name them or label them. It's also good when we do this kind of work because it helps us to ramp up and kind of circle back. So you think of ramping up to the more complex performance, the iterations of the drafts in which the students finally give you something to grade, you move on to the next unit. But also this idea of circling back constantly during each class. How am I making sure that I'm monitoring progress in kind of a really visible way? And also the nice thing about these kinds of tools and exemplars, in our case, we have a lot of what we call helicopter parents in this generation. These are parents who spend a lot of time making sure they know what we're doing and the students are doing. And that may be very culturally laden with the US experience. But I just want to say this, as a parent myself, I always felt better when I went to one of the open houses if I knew that the teacher who was teaching my daughter had some sense other than a grade book of how she's doing. And I thought that if we saw more examples of her work or ways in which her work was progressing or improving, that I could feel like, gosh, this teacher really has a good sense of the trajectory of growth and learning for my child. So I think this idea of sharing the tools we have with the stakeholders involved in our educational process is also important, at least in our context. We just want people to know kind of what we're up to. So looking ahead, well, let's begin to close this up. We promised we would do this in an hour, and I think we're going to hit it in an hour. The formative feedback framework, we think, centers us on communicating learning goals with visible processes that can be seen by everybody, most importantly, our students. We also think the framework allows us to engage in multiple information exchanges in different kaleidoscope type lenses, different ways to focus in on different parts of our practice, as well as our children's own emerging understanding of the importance of self-assessment. And we also think that focusing on closing gaps, we hear a lot about that gap talk, and that's all we hear, closing the learning gap, learning loss. We don't have enough achievement in this area or that area. You know, can we just push that all aside for a moment and say, so what's going on in our classroom on Tuesday and on Wednesday and on Thursday? And how are we working to provide next step leaps and supports for every child in every part of our classroom learning space? To us, that's a really important thing. If you want to think about quality formative feedback in any framework with any approach, we would suggest that you at least take a good amount of attention on what are your learning targets? Let's define them for students. The school I taught at in Central Park East in New York City, we had something called the habits of mind. Habits of mind were our learning targets. They included evidence, perspective, connections, speculation, and relevance. In every classroom, whether it was 7th grade or 12th grade, you saw those words and questions under each, in your science class, your history class, your Spanish class. Those learning targets were embedded in the culture of the school so that you could never be in a classroom and not know, well, so what is the evidence for what we're doing in this science class? And how does that differ from the economics class we're taking? You know, having that embedded in the school site mattered. Even if you're just doing it in your own classroom, let the kids know what you value. Then have those well-articulated success criteria linked to something concrete for them, not just the words on the wall, but these progress guides where they can kind of see, oh yeah, we're working on evidence again, or oh yeah, we're working on making connections again, and getting them in that process of seeing the rhythm of that work. And again, a wide sample of student responses, because we do believe that we need student A and student C to be included in our ideas about feedback and really what we can do to make a difference. Maybe one big takeaway, at least in the context we teach in, and we hope in New Zealand we can invite you in with us on this, to better differentiate feedback, we can start by reviewing those rubrics. Maybe we don't have them. Maybe at our school here in New Zealand, we're not using rubrics a lot. But let's just say we've got some kind of a scaffolded something. Let's review that. Then let's think about embedding next step scaffolds, little micro things that students can get a hold of. They can get a hold of on a Monday morning, and they can do that within the first 10 minutes of the lesson. And then we can think more about this progress guide idea. Rather than create a progress guide for every assignment, for every classroom, for everything. No, let's treat when we're strategic in our thinking. Let's pick out the places we think of signature assignment, big idea, a really important thing that comes through the whole curriculum.
And let's be honest about what creating the progress guides activity yielded us.
Oh, yeah.
Right, if you do that right, because it will, there'll be different kinds of learning that teachers will experience from creating progress guides.
There's some teachers we had who were fantastic teachers. They actually admitted to us, of course, we pseudonym everything, but they said, like, well, I used to approach this with right and wrong, correct, incorrect when I walked around the classroom. I'm thinking, oh no, I know you didn't do that only. But I think the point was the progress guide really brought to the fore of their thinking. Boy, no, I actually do see that there are like 4 levels to this. It just took them time to reflect on it to be able to get there. Okay, so with that in mind, we gave NZCER some homework because you've hosted us graciously and we're grateful to be here at your service. The homework that we see is really powerful potentially would be some well-designed local teacher-generated assessments that yield information for assessing actual progress during instruction. And supporting that with some proven assessment strategies that allow for iterations of student work. So the emphasis goes back to how do we see those feedback loops, 1 or 2 or 3 occurring over an assignment that we're considering to be a very important locally generated, teacher-driven, common agreement that this is something we want to be doing because of the power of our work and respects our work. There are some references for this. We're glad to provide these PowerPoints in the form of a PDF, anyone who has access as well. Yeah. Thank you very much. We appreciate your time today.